Mass testing for the CCP virus in Qingdao city continues. Authorities report 0 new virus cases within the last 3 days and claim 500,000 already tested negative. But some signs indicate the opposite. And the head of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, coughed 4 times within 8 minutes during a speech. South Korean boy band BTS is facing a barrage of criticism in China. This after the band leader made remarks about the Korean War. A French museum said no to China because the communist regime wanted to, as the French called it, rewrite a collection aiming to completely eliminate Mongolian history and culture. And China's ally Pakistan banned TikTok. This short video sharing app is owned by a Chinese company and triggered security concerns in Western countries. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. First, we turn to an update on the CCP virus outbreak in Qingdao City. The eastern Chinese city entered the 3rd day of mass testing of the CCP virus on Wednesday. According to official data, this city is home to 9 million permanent residents. But local media reports on Wednesday stated that 11 million people would be made to undergo mass testing. The reports didn't give details on who was included in that figure, but some suspect it may include those who live there but aren't registered as permanent residents. That could include visitors, college students, or workers from other areas. So far, the city's official results appear promising. As of Wednesday, 800,000 people had been tested, while 500,000 of them came back negative. Not a single test has come back positive yet. With no new confirmed cases found over the past 3 days since mass testing began, the city's total remains at 12 if the official figures are accurate. But some signs seem to indicate a very different situation. Chinese netizens on Tuesday posted a photo online, noting that medical teams from other regions were being sent to Qingdao to assist local medical staff. The next day, Chinese state-run media reported that the National Health Commission had allocated 9,000 milliliter plasma for patients in Qingdao. The report explained that the plasma is considered an emergency treatment. Collected from recovered virus patients, it's only given to those who are critically ill. Yet according to official data, there are not critically ill patients inside the city. The Chinese regime says the situation in the city is well under control, but suspicions are rising, with some saying the city's outbreak actually started back in late September. Some netizens speculate that authorities were aware of it but didn't announce it publicly. A photo shared online shows what appears to be an internal warning for staff of one Chinese hospital. It was put out by the first affiliated hospital of Naval Military Medical University in Shanghai City, also known as Shanghai Hospital. It advises anyone that had planned to visit Qingdao during China's week-long National Day holiday should refrain for the time being. China's National Day is often marked by a huge surge in travel and tourism across the country. The internal notice was issued on September 29th, days before the start of the event. Now we turn to Chinese Communist Party head Xi Jinping and a recent speech that's causing a stir online. But his words weren't what drew attention. Xi spoke during a 40th anniversary celebration on Wednesday, marking the establishment of the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone in southern China. His remarks lasted for about an hour, but during the last 8 minutes, he coughed 4 times. As soon as Xi started coughing, the Communist Party's media mouthpiece, CCTV, immediately cut away from the podium. Instead of keeping the cameras trained on Xi, TV coverage opted to show shots of the audience. But even though it wasn't seen, sounds of his coughing and drinking from a cup of water could still be heard clearly. The incident comes amid a sensitive social climate in China, where many remain concerned about the potential for resurging virus outbreaks. Comments by Korean celebrities about the Korean War have ignited anger in China and prompted a wave of Chinese boycotts. But much of the Chinese criticism appears to be based on false history, part of the Chinese regime's propaganda narrative.
South Korean boy band BTS is facing a barrage of criticism in China. This after BTS leader made remarks about the Korean War. and several big-name brands apparently distanced themselves from the K-pop group amid the uproar. Posts featuring Samsung's BTS Special Edition smartphones and earphones disappeared from several Chinese e-commerce platforms. BTS-related posts from other companies, including sports fashion brand Fila and car maker Hyundai, also disappeared from their official Weibo accounts. The BTS leader, RM, has upset many people in China. He gave a speech when the band received an award for their contribution to South Korea-US relations and noted a history of pain shared between South Korea and the United States. He referred to the Korean War, which began in 1950, speaking of sacrifices of countless men and women. The war pitted South Korean and U.S. forces against those of North Korea and China. The comments have sparked heated debates on social media in China. One angry Weibo user said this about BTS: "They should not make any money from China." He also added that if you want to make money from Chinese fans, you have to consider Chinese feelings. But the BTS comment got an unusually mild reply from the Chinese spokesman of the Foreign Affairs Ministry, who claimed that cherishing peace and promoting friendship should be our common pursuit. In the meantime, the topic has suddenly disappeared from China's Weibo hot search list. South Korea's Yonhap news agency believes that the Chinese communist regime wants to avoid this issue because of delicate relations between North and South Korea. China remains the most important partner of North Korea, while U.S. support lies with South Korea. Chinese Communist Party propaganda is another factor that has been playing a critical role. The CCP calls the Korean War a battle to resist the U.S., help North Korea, and to guard home and defend the country, when in fact North Korea initiated the war by crossing the border and declaring war against South Korea with the Soviets' consent and support. Despite the chaos and poverty in China during the early 1950s, then CCP leader Mao Zedong still sent troops at the request of the Soviet Union. According to Beijing, China paid the price of 180,000 soldiers' lives. However, U.S. statistics says China actually suffered a loss of 400,000 people. Many Chinese still believe that it was a war of justice and take their anger as a reflection of their patriotism.
Now we turn to a group from the southwestern Chinese city Chongqing. On Monday, 30 residents went to the municipal authorities to appeal and submit a petition. They're facing what's become a common problem in China: the destruction and seizure of their property.
The problem went back to 9 years ago. More than 1,000 police officers were deployed to Xianma area in Beibei district and arrested 50 people. These people were against the district authorities of having demolished their houses and taking their land without reasonable compensation. During the scuffle, Li Zhongxiu's father was injured by the police and died afterwards from the injuries.
My parents were injured during the chaos. They sent my parents to the hospital afterwards, and after staying in the hospital for a few days, they forced my parents to leave the hospital. After that, they forced them to swear that they were voluntarily discharged. Just a few days after the discharge, he died. My father died.
Li said that the local government has been trying to stall their appeals.
For example, if you go to the petition office today, you must wait 2 months just to be able to petition. This is how they try to stall us. You can't even reach the people in petition office anymore.
In China, all the land belongs to the country. It's a common praxis that authorities take over land of residential area for other profitable projects, sometimes with very little or no compensation. This has been triggering protests across China for years. Li said the local government has been acting as a protective force for village officers and gangsters, all the while using them for forced land acquisition and house demolition. She added that the local officials have also put the villagers' compensation for land acquisition into their own pockets. Said that the local people were forced to fight for their own rights and have been suppressed by the authorities. The Security Bureau of Beibei District also openly said to He Chaozheng that the land acquisition is not his business, although his own house was demolished. NTD News.
U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is calling out the UN Human Rights Council. He says it continues to embrace authoritarian regimes that abuse human rights. Pompeo says the UN once again elected countries with appalling human rights records to sit on the council Tuesday, including China, Russia, and Cuba. President Trump withdrew from the council in 2018, and the U.S. has urged UN members to reform the council before it's too late. Pompeo says yesterday's elections validate the U.S. decision to withdraw. He says the State Department has punished human rights abusers in Xinjiang, Iran, and Myanmar and elsewhere. Pompeo says the U.S. commitment to human rights goes far beyond mere words. The Trump administration is cracking down on foreign funding in U.S. think tanks and academic institutions. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced the move on Tuesday. Now, U.S. think tanks and academic institutions are requested to publicly disclose what foreign funding they receive. If they don't, they could lose access to State Department officials. This comes amid growing bipartisan concerns about foreign influence from countries like China in American academia and policy. Pompeo said in a statement the purpose is to promote free and open dialogue, untainted by the machinations of authoritarian regimes. Pompeo named China and Russia in his statement as two examples of foreign powers seeking to exert influence over U.S. foreign policy through lobbyists, external experts, and think tanks. The history around the practice is murky. Some think tanks and academic institutions refuse any foreign funding, but others accept it. But those that do are not legally required to disclose such funding. Pompeo said in the statement that disclosing any funding was not essential, but the State Department will take the disclosure or the absence of any disclosure into account when deciding how to work with organizations. There's been increased scrutiny in recent years over the role foreign governments play in influencing American institutions. Conservative news outlet The Washington Free Beacon reported earlier this year on the Turkish government's role at the Atlantic Council think tank. And the New York Times in 2014 delved into how several governments from Europe and the Middle East spent millions on influential think tanks such as the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Brookings Institution. Internet freedom continues to fall for a decade straight. That's according to a new report by human and digital rights watchdog Freedom House. The annual Internet Freedom Report looked at 65 countries who make up 87% of the world's internet users. It found the scores of 26 countries worsened this year, while only 22 improved. It also found of the 3.8 billion people using the internet, only 20% lived in countries with uncensored internet access. The Chinese regime heads the list as the worst abuser of internet freedom. It's the 6th year in a row that China is at the top. Russia, Pakistan, and Iran also fell under the not free category. 3 main takeaways from the report. Firstly, the report found political leaders use the pandemic as a pretext to limit access to information. It found multiple instances of authorities blocking independent news sites or individuals from sharing information. Some were even arrested on charges like spreading false information. The report found it was the officials themselves in many cases who were publishing false information. Secondly, authorities used the pandemic as an excuse to harvest personal data without the standard protections against abuse. The report said the process of obtaining this data often lacked transparency, independent oversight, and avenues for redress. It found at least 30 countries took advantage of the global pandemic to launch mass surveillance powers. It also warned of a dystopian future where sensitive information was readily accessible to private companies, security agencies, and cyber criminals. Thirdly, the report warned of a move towards an authoritarian-style cyber sovereignty, like the kind in communist China. It's a splintering of the internet, with each government restricting the flow of information across borders. The new head of MI5 UK security service says that Britain faces state-backed hostility from Russia and China, among a cauldron of threats.
MI5 boss Ken McCallum says the UK faces a, quote, nasty mix of national security threats, with state-backed hostile activity by Russia and China on the rise.
If the question is, which country's intelligence services caused the most aggravation to the UK in October 2020, the answer is Russia.
He then named the country that would bring the biggest long-term challenges.
The answer is China. You might think in terms of the Russian intelligence services providing bursts of bad weather, while China is changing the climate.
According to McCallum, British spies are trying to defend the country from increasingly diverse and complex threats.
We see threats to our democracy, threats to our infrastructure, threats to our economy, threats to our academic research. It really does cover a very broad range.
MI5 is tasked with protecting Britain's national security. Its main job currently is countering international terrorism, though it is also a counterintelligence agency.
Over 100 scholars are calling for academic freedom. The letter protests the national security law Beijing imposed on Hong Kong, saying it's an assault on academic freedom. Scholars from 71 academic institutions and hailing from 16 countries have already co-signed the letter. Under Article 38 of the National Security Law, non-Hong Kong residents are subject to the same punishment if they violate the law outside the country. Scholars say this is an affront against freedom of speech and undermines academic autonomy. This comes as a group of academics across the UK are calling for a new code of conduct to protect academic freedom. A French museum announced on Monday that it has decided to cancel its partnership with a Chinese museum. It was set to host an exhibition about Mongolian history and culture. The Nantes History Museum from Western France is seeking European and American collections to work with. Since September, the CCP has hardened its stance on the Mongolian population in the Chinese-ruled Inner Mongolia region. It's caught international attention. In this context, Chinese authorities require the French museum to avoid certain keywords in the exhibition. That includes terms like Mongolian Empire and Genghis Khan, the name of the founder of the Mongol Empire, who lived about 1,000 years ago. The exhibit title was even changed to Chinese Steppe Culture of the World in order to avoid the word Mongolian. The museum described the move as rewriting aimed at completely eliminating Mongolian history and culture. Chinese telecom company Huawei may sell some parts of its smartphone business in order to protect it from U.S. sanctions. That's as a new report disclosed the company's core product relies heavily on U.S. technologies, which are now battered under sanctions.
Chinese tech giant Huawei might be selling part of its smartphone unit. That's so the unit won't be affected by the U.S. sanctions. This, according to a Reuters report. Huawei is the world's #2 smartphone maker. Its smartphone unit Honor takes up about a quarter of the company's smartphone sales.
Thank you for your support and love of Honor, which maintained its #1 online sales in China position in the first half of 2020.
Analysts say the potential sale would benefit Huawei. It would free the part of its business from U.S. trade restrictions and allow the company to focus on other high-end phone units. Huawei denied the sale plan. The Chinese company is the world's biggest vendor of telecom equipment like cell phone towers. Last year, the U.S. government banned most U.S. companies from doing business with Huawei, saying that it may submit data gathered from its equipment around the globe to Communist China.
Not to use Huawei because we think it's an unsafe security risk. It's a big security risk.
Huawei was founded by a former Chinese military officer. By law, all Chinese companies are required to hand over their data to Chinese authorities if asked. This year, the Trump administration issued new bans, cutting off Huawei's access to the crucial semiconductors or chips it needs to produce telecom gear and smartphones. The move struck a death blow to the company.
We at Huawei are going through a difficult time with the third round of U.S. sanctions.
Huawei now relies on its stockpile inventory of chips. An analyst said last month that they may run out in half a year. Huawei's leading revenue source is 5G telecom base stations also rely heavily on U.S.-made parts. They too fall under U.S. sanctions. That's according to a recent report by Japanese media outlet Nikkei Asia Review. Nearly 30% of the telecom base station's total production cost come from U.S.-made chips and other components. Less than 10% of its components originate from China. Penny Zhou, NTD News.
Apple is launching its first 5G-enabled device, the iPhone 12. The company may count on the next-generation network's super-fast data speeds to win the favor of Chinese customers. China is the world's biggest 5G smartphone market and the second-largest market for Apple. This as Apple's Chinese rival Huawei says it will launch its new tech later this month. Apple takes up 42% of China's premium smartphone market, compared to Huawei's 48%. But the Chinese company is struggling. A recent business report shows that Huawei's valuation shrank by $14 billion this year because of U.S. sanctions. That's an 8% decrease. The report also shows that 5 of the top 10 most valuable Chinese consumer electronics companies are smartphone markets. But the worth of the 10 companies combined only reaches 16% of Apple's valuation. Apple's potential in China is complicated by geopolitical conflict. This May, Beijing officials said they are ready to put U.S. companies, including Apple, on a so-called unreliable entity list. The move would stand as one of several Chinese countermeasures against U.S. sanctions on Huawei. And in Pakistan, the country's telecom regulator blocked TikTok last Friday for failing to filter out what it called immoral and indecent content. The criticism comes as yet another blow to the social media platform. TikTok is owned by China-based ByteDance. The short video sharing app quickly surged to popularity, especially among younger users. But a number of countries are now raising security and privacy concerns over its links to the Chinese Communist regime. In June, the app was blocked in India, its largest market at that time. India cited national security concerns amid a border dispute with China at the time. TikTok also faces the threat of a U.S. ban, as well as scrutiny in other countries like Australia. Pakistan's move comes in contrast to other countries who've blocked the app. Many of them maintain tense political relationships with the Chinese regime. But Pakistan remains closely tied to Beijing, both diplomatically and militarily. Pakistan is also an active participant in China's Belt and Road Initiative, an infrastructure development plan largely targeted toward poorer nations. China has reportedly banned imports of Australian coal. Beijing hasn't yet made an official announcement, but 2 financial news websites report that state-owned steel mills in China have received verbal notice from officials to stop importing Australian coal. Some Australian vessels are left stuck at Chinese ports. Australia's Prime Minister says it's not new or uncommon for Beijing to impose domestic import quotas.
And I can only assume, based on our relationship and based on the discussions we have with the Chinese government, that that is just part of their normal process.
The ban comes as Australia takes a harder stance against the Chinese regime's aggression. Last week, Australia, together with nearly 40 other countries, condemned China's human rights abuse towards the Uyghur ethnic group in Xinjiang. Earlier this year, the country called for an independent investigation into the origin of the CCP virus in China. Australia has also previously banned controversial Chinese telecom giant Huawei from joining its 5G networks. China is the world's biggest importer of Australian coal. By June of this year, 27% of Australia's coking coal used to make steel and 20% of its thermal coal were sold to China. Coal exports make up over 16% of Australia's overall exports. And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you tomorrow.